what can I say after the speech you just heard, after the wonderful speech you just heard? I was completely impressed, and it's very difficult now for me to talk after this speech. Respected audience, distinguished colleagues from various universities, dear students, this is a great moment for me. I never expected to be, to be in a room like this with so many people interested in Buddhism and interested in Pali. In Germany, it's no problem to fill a room with people interested in Buddhism. But Pali scholars or people studying Pali, being interested in Pali, there are quite a few. And so this is wonderful to see so many people here who take an interest, who have some devotion for Pali studies, and this means Buddhist studies. This is really wonderful, and I'm not only deeply honored to be here, to be invited to talk to you, it's also a great, great pleasure. It's really a great moment in my life. Thank you very much for inviting me. So, what can I tell you? You've heard several very good speeches by distinguished people. I cannot tell you anything about Buddhism or Pali in Maharashtra, which you do not already know, or other people, or you have just heard, or other people can tell you much better. So I asked myself, what can I tell you? The one thing I know a little bit more than most people here in the room, I think, is how Pali, the knowledge of Pali, the study of Pali began, how it came to the West, and how it began in the West, and how it developed in the West. And I'll take this occasion to say a few words, starting as bad speakers do with myself, then telling something. And the history of Pali in the West is a long history, but don't worry, I make it a short story. I tell something about the history of these studies and then end with myself again. Bad style, but it's, in a way, it will be funny for you. So I went to a good school, like many of you, and I learned 2 classical languages. Latin, from the first moment I went to high school, and then ancient Greek, which is also in the West an important classical language. So I think I understand something about classical languages. What makes a language classical? It's ancient, of course, and it has it preserves an important literature. Does Pali fulfill these requirements? Of course. It's an ancient language, it's quite an ancient language, and it preserves a very important part of Indian and world literature. This is important not only for Maharashtra, for India, or for Theravada countries. This is a heritage important for the world. So when I was young, already at school, at the end of my time at school, I had my first contact with Pali, and I come back to that later. So it's a long time that I have some idea of this language. When did knowledge of Pali arrive in the West, in Europe? This was about 350 years ago, also quite a while ago, when travelers went to Sri Lanka and Siam, Thailand, and brought back some knowledge. So perhaps the first was a British traveler, Robert Knox, who in 1681 published a book. He went to Sri Lanka and he published a book with the title Historical Relation of Ceylon, relation in the sense of report, historical report of Ceylon, and he wrote something about Pali. That was not very precise, but 10 years later, a French person, an envoy, so a political person, an envoy of King Louis, the famous French King Louis XIV, sent to the king of Siam, to the king of Thailand. He came back in 1691 and he published a book, a work, and I tell you the French title because that was the first, Description du Royaume de Siam in Paris, published in Paris, and only 2 years later, so it was evidently a success, the book. Only 2 years later, there was it appeared a translation, a new historical relation, again relation in the sense of report, of the kingdom of Siam. And this contains a lot of interesting and correct information, not only on Buddhism in Thailand, but also on Pali. And this is quite surprising, but it is easily explained, although this was a political undertaking. This person, Simon de la Lubière, he took interest, personal interest, and he went to the monasteries and talked to the monks, inquired. So like some modern scholar, like an ethnologist, he went to the places where he found sources, living sources, and he used this information he got. So to give you two examples, he provided the first clear description of the term Nibbana, something completely unknown in the West at that time. So he described what he had heard from monks in Thailand, and this was this description was characterized by a modern scholar as, a quote, an amazingly modern evaluation of the term. So, end of the 17th century, the first reliable information came to the West. And Simon de la Lubière, he was also the first, in an appendix to his book, he described the Patimokkha, so the rules for of the Buddhist monks and nuns. And this was the first acquaintance in the West with this part of the Vinaya Pitaka. Now, I make a big jump because these books raised interest, but they had no, at that time, no immediate academic consequence. When did the study of Pali as a language and the study of the sources written in Pali, when did it start in the West? And this was in the course of the second half of the 19th century. One important, very important date until today, I should mention here, was the formation of the Pali Text Society in 1881, and by famous scholar Thomas William Rhys Davids in 1881. And I just learned from my colleague here, Ujjwal Kumar, that apparently in Calcutta University in the same year, Pali studies were established. I didn't know that. It's a wonderful coincidence in a way. Beginning of Pali studies in India and this foundation of the Pali Text Society, which became very influential and very important in the following process of reception of Buddhism in the West, and not only scholarly, academic reception, because as many of you will know, what did the Pali Text Society do? They started to publish Pali texts in Latin transliteration, so in Latin letters, which made it much more easy to use for Western people, Western scholars. And they published the original texts, starting with the Tipitaka, Vinaya Pitaka, Sutta Pitaka, Vidhamma Pitaka, but then also going on to the Attakatas, the primary commentaries, and even to the Tikas, the second commentaries written on the Attakatas. And they also published so-called non-canonical works like Peta Vatu, Netipakarana, and so, and Milinda Panna, important Pali text with a very specific status. And they also included the historical sources, Mahavamsa and Dipavamsa, which provided information in the West about the history of, the early history of not only Sri Lanka, but also Theravada Buddhism. So very important sources made accessible in original text in Latin transliteration, but not only that, Pali Text Society also provided translations of a lot of texts. Until today, more than 200 editions and more than 200 translations. And the editions of, like the Digha Nikaya consists of 3 volumes, Samyutta Nikaya of 5 volumes. So the real number of volumes is much higher. And this was extremely important for the academic development on one hand, and for the reception of Buddhism on the other hand. So the Buddhism which was received in the West in the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, that was basically Pali Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, which very much dominated the reception in the West. And I can, and this gives me a chance to switch to the German-speaking world, where the translations of the Pali Text Society were less received. But there was an Austrian scholar, and I want to mention his name so that you hear it at least once in your life, Karl Eugen Neumann, who lived from 1865 to 1915. He was born and he died in Vienna, but he studied in Germany. And he studied Indology at various places with professors who were also well acquainted with Pali. So that's where he learned Pali, and he started to translate Pali scriptures into German, starting with the Majjhima Nikaya, then Digha Nikaya, and several other texts. And this was, he is, posthumously, he was styled the first Austrian Buddhist. If he was the first or not, this is difficult to say, but he was extremely influential because his translations, they were written, and this is funny, they were written in a language, in a form of German, which is difficult to digest today. You find it a little, it's like mannerism, exaggerated or so. And already at his, during his lifetime, it found criticism. But despite the fact that you would not read it happily today, it was very, very influential in the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And where was it influential? In the whole educated part of the society. It's amazing if you read poets at that time, if you look at artists, composers. So to give you one example, some of you will have heard the name of Richard Wagner, a famous German composer of operas. And this Richard Wagner, he had read about Buddhism. He had read translation, he had read a famous introduction to Buddhism written in German, and he wanted to compose an opera about the Buddha. And he had already started to make a, how do you call that in English? A sketch how it should develop. We know this story, it was the Buddhist story it was based on, and there are some beginnings. It was called, the prospective title was The Jinnah, the sea, what's the English word? The one who, Jinnah? Conquers, yeah. Conquers is not so, it's of course a word for the Buddha, and it doesn't fit, it fits a king, but not the Buddha so well. So the German word is more appropriate, but I don't know how to translate it in English. But so Richard Wagner is one example among many. It's surprising when you take interest in literature of that time. Everywhere you find references to Buddhism, and quite often to the translations by Karl Eugen Neumann. This, and now I finally come back to me, this very much dominated the reception in Germany. And how was that received in the educated public? Societies were founded. Societies where Buddhism, and it was always Theravada Buddhism, was studied. So what was my first, how to say, my first meeting with Theravada Buddhism in Munich, where I came, where I'm born, and where I lived and studied. In Munich, we had a Buddhist Society Munich, BGM, Buddhistische Gesellschaft München. And this was a group of interested people, educated people, who met once a month to discuss Buddhism, to discuss Buddhist scriptures, and based on the Pali texts. So they were, in a way, Pali scholars is too much, but they also looked sometimes at the original text, at the Pali, but mostly discussing it in German, of course. And so this was my first contact with Pali literature, with Theravada Buddhism. And then I read an introduction, a very good introduction into Buddhism, completely based on Theravada, on Pali sources, and learned the words, Tilakkhana, Anatta, Dukkha, and so. So there's my first, how to say, a meeting with Buddhism in Buddhist sources was through Pali, which was at that time basically the only accessible in only accessible form in the local languages, in German or English. So I owe a lot to these people who took interest. Otherwise, without that, I would not stand here today. I had this possibility to learn something, and Pali is still taught at a number of German universities, so it belongs always within Indology, and you can usually choose if you focus on Sanskrit or on Pali studies. Clever people do both because it's useful, and there's a very solid, how to say, very solid tradition of Pali studies, of Pali grammar, and of the texts in German academia. This is how I came in contact with Buddhism. And this, in a way, this is what brought me here today. And this ends my talk. But I want to, as a conclusion, I want to make a statement and an apology. the statement, I'm very impressed to see, and this is the second time that I've been invited, I'm quite surprised, the second time that I've been invited to Pune University, to this Department of Pali and Buddhist Studies. And I don't know much about other Indian universities, but I do know a little bit, and I must say this is one of the best places here. This Professor Mahesh Deokar, who regrettably cannot be here with us today due to other obligations, he did a really great job. And there were others, I mean, you're sitting there, several people who supported him. I don't think he could have done it alone. You always need people around you to support. And you need not only 3 or 4 people to make something, to create something worthwhile. You need a community. And this is what I see sitting here, an interested community. And I wish to congratulate you and I wish to thank you for your interest, devotion, and readiness to contribute, readiness to do something which I would say in our present time, and the recent developments are not very encouraging worldwide. Worldwide, in Germany, wherever I look, I find problems, and sometimes very severe problems. So the Ukrainian war is much closer to us geographically than to you. And this is something which makes us very afraid. Trump, I don't say anything about him. It's not necessary. It's in a way a nightmare. And there are similar, the worst case in various European countries, you have similar tendencies. Back from, to, how to say it, not to focus so much on democracy, but on other political forms, which in Germany we had. And we know what it leads to. So we don't want to have that ever again. And now, are there any counter agents against these developments? It's very difficult to say. As the Buddha told us, life is anicca and dukkha. So we will not overcome dukkha before we reach, not completely overcome dukkha before we reach Nibbana. But interest in Buddhism, the Buddha's teaching, the Buddha's message is one of the most excellent means to counteract such developments. If we take it serious, if we let it influence our personal life. And so I see many people here who take this interest, who let themselves being influenced by this wonderful message. And it is a wonderful message. I think we all agree about that. And so, again, I want to felicitate you, I want to congratulate you, and I wish you all the best for future and the future of Pali studies here in Pune, in Maharashtra, and everywhere in India. And now, my apology. I will have to leave before the end of this event. Why? Family reasons. Tonight, I have to go to Mumbai because tonight one of my sons will arrive to visit me for a week. And had I known this event before, I would have made sure that he arrived one day earlier to take part and participate and meet all of you and participate in this event. Thank you very much and all the best.